Good evening. Hello, everyone, and welcome to another of the programs from the History Consortium. And this evening's program, we are fortunate enough to have with us Matthew Borders, who holds a BA in U.S. History and an MS in Historic Preservation. He's worked for the National Park Service as a ranger at Antietam National Battlefield, and as well as a historian and battlefield surveyor for the National Park Service's American Battlefield Protection Program. And he's currently a ranger at the Monocacy National Battlefield. So we're very fortunate to have Matthew Borders with us this evening, and he's going to talk about the Loudon Valley Campaign of 1862, McClellan's final advance. And I should also mention that the research that he did on this topic gave him the honor of a recipient of an honor from the Save Historic Antietam Foundation. So we're very fortunate to have Matthew with us tonight, and I think he's going to give us a slightly different perspective on General McClellan. So maybe we'll all get a new look at Little Mac. So Matthew, thank you very much, and please take it away.
Excellent. Thank you, Jeff. It's a pleasure to be here with the History Consortium, and of course, my friends here at the Frederick County Public Library for hosting. We're going to jump right into it this evening. Let me pull up the presentation here, and we're going to be looking at the Loudon Valley Campaign of 1862. Certainly not one of those campaigns that's particularly well known. This is McClellan's last campaign, his last advance into Virginia, sometimes known as the Second Virginia Campaign. But before we do that, of course, we have to do a little follow-up from Antietam, the bloodiest day. And one of the great misnomers about the Maryland campaign, and particularly the Battle of Antietam, is that there was no pursuit of Lee's army. Well, of course there was. We have the bloody exclamation point of the Maryland campaign, which is the Battle of Shepherdstown, fought September 19th and 20th, 1862, where federal forces will pursue Robert E. Lee across the Potomac River and get into what it was still at that point part of Virginia. Now, ironically, while federal forces have won at Antietam, they will receive a loss, actually a real bloody nose from Lee's rear guard at Shepherdstown, which would add an additional 673 casualties to the massive casualties that have been sustained during the Maryland campaign. As this fighting was going on, here's another Harper's Weekly image of that movement, we would actually have Confederate forces moving north of Shepherdstown as well. Jeb Stuart is going to be looking at Williamsport, Maryland, as a possible re-entry point into Maryland by Confederate forces. Lee is pondering continuing his campaign, but it would be due to this pursuit by McClellan and the Union advance towards the Confederate rear that Lee is going to call off that advance. There is brief fighting between Jeb Stuart and Darius Couch's 4th Corps, or elements of the 4th Corps, at Williamsport on the 19th, and the campaign afterwards is over. And once it's over, the Army of the Potomac is going to spread out. So we've had fighting at Shepherdstown, we've had fighting at Williamsport, and now the Army of the Potomac is going to come up to the river and spread itself out. We will have federal camps spread from Williamsport down to Sharpsburg and all the way down to Harper's Ferry. And of course, on September 22nd, federal forces will recapture Harper's Ferry, and Harper's Ferry is going to be the source of significant resources and planning for the coming campaign. Now, with federal forces spreading out along the Potomac, they are going to go into a period of rest and resupply. Most of us are familiar with this 3 to 4 weeks of basically rebuilding the army. And something I want you to keep in mind is that the Confederates are doing much the same thing. Lee will fall back to Winchester, Virginia, where his railroad head is, and basically begin to rest and resupply his forces as well. So both commanders, Lee and McClellan, are doing the same thing at this point. It would be during this rebuilding period that we would have significant concerns coming out of Washington. Henry Halleck, the general-in-chief, would comment, "It seems to me that Washington is the real base of operations and that it should not be under any circumstances exposed. And he's going to send this message just a few days after the campaign has ended on September 26, 1862. At the same time, we're also going to be having lots of new recruits being shifted to the Army of the Potomac. There's George McClellan there, and he's going to be receiving 20 regiments of new troops from the defenses of Washington, D.C., sent by railroad to Frederick to report to him there at the Army along the Potomac River. These recruits, these new regiments, are supposed to make good the losses that have been sustained by the Army of the Potomac over the Northern Virginia campaign, Second Bull Run, and of course the Maryland campaign and the heavy fighting there. With the Army of the Potomac, though, and all these new recruits, we're going to have significant supply problems. There is said to be a good deal of suffering among our men for want of clothing, especially blankets and shoes. The losses of the Pope affair, again, Second Bull Run, have not been made good yet. Many of the men are quite barefooted, and others are without a blanket. The necessary requisitions for them have been made, but none have yet been received. This comes from the Chief of Artillery for the Union First Corps, Colonel Charles Wainwright. And it's not going to be just Wainwright, who does have a tendency to complain about everything over the course of his career. This is coming from very solid infantry commanders as well. Alpheus Williams here would say much the same thing as Wainwright. By some fatality or by the general crowding, we are lacking much. There seems to be an unaccountable delay in forwarding supplies. We want shoes and blankets and overcoats, indeed almost everything. I have sent requisition upon requisition, officers to Washington, made reports and complaints, and yet we are not half supplied. And be careful here. Look at the date on that. That's October 26th, 1862. So here's Wainwright. He's talking September 26th, requisition problems. Alpheus Williams is talking a month later, same requisition problems. And keep that date in mind, October 26th, because that's actually going to be the beginning of the Second Valley or the Second Virginia campaign. Now, with these supply issues and problems, we're going to have a lot of confusion. And that's coming from, in no small part, due to the fact that we have a lot of different communications going on between, for instance, George McClellan, right below him being Colonel Ingalls, the commander of his, or I should say the quartermaster of the Army of the Potomac. Across from McClellan and Ingalls is Henry Halleck, the general-in-chief of the United States Army. Next to Halleck is Montgomery Meigs, the quartermaster general of the United States. And finally, the gentleman to the far right is Henry Haupt, the commander of the military railroad, the guy who's going to take all these supplies that are being brought together by folks such as Meigs and actually get them out to the various armies. All of these men have extremely important jobs, and all of them are talking to not only their chain of commands, but also to each other. So this is going to lead to a lot of supply confusion and problems getting the supplies to the Army of the Potomac. Now, as this is being dealt with, we're also going to have another wrench thrown into the thing, a presidential visit from Abraham Lincoln himself. On October 1st, 1862, it would be Secretary of the Navy Gideon Welles who would note in his diary, called this morning at the White House, but learned that the president had left the city. The porter said that he had no mention whither he was going, nor when he would return. I have no doubt he is on a visit to McClellan and the Army. None of his cabinet have been made aware of this journey. So President Abraham Lincoln has slipped out of Washington. He is going to see the Army of the Potomac and visit his commander in the field. George McClellan is going to get wind of this trip real quick, and he's not too thrilled about it. His ostensible purpose is to see the troops in the battlefields. I incline to think that the real purpose of his visit is to push me into a premature advance into Virginia. So not a lot of trust right now between the commander of the Army of the Potomac, George McClellan, and the President of the United States, Abraham Lincoln. McClellan wrote this on October 2nd, so Lincoln has already been around for about half a day at this point. And he's writing it to his ever-faithful wife, Mary Ellen McClellan, who they keep up a very robust correspondence throughout McClellan's time with the Army. But President Lincoln does visit the Army of the Potomac. This very interesting group shot. Actually, we know most of the people in this image. The large gentleman sitting in the chair is Howard Hill Lamon, who is essentially Lincoln's personal bodyguard, old friend of Lincoln's, but he's kind of put himself into that role as Lincoln's bodyguard. He's also the United States Marshal for the District of Columbia. The gentleman in the white hat next to Lamon is Osias Hatch, the Illinois Secretary of State. The officer there with his arms crossed is Chief of McClellan's staff, Randall B. Marcy. Interestingly enough, Colonel Marcy is also McClellan's father-in-law. Now, the officer with the beard and the hat that's next to Lincoln, that's Major General John McClernand, who is traveling with Lincoln's party because he desperately wants an independent command from Ulysses S. Grant. He's a Western officer and a political general. Of course, President Lincoln stands there in the middle, and next to him, the slightly shorter gentleman in the long coat and kepi is Major General George McClellan. Finally, the gentleman in the light coat next to McClellan is the superintendent of the census, Joseph Kennedy, and in the white hat there to the right, the rotund gentleman is the president of the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad, John Garrett. So quite a diverse party Lincoln is traveling with to go see McClellan. And Lincoln is going to take the train out to Point of Rocks. He detrains there. He would see the battlefield around Harper's Ferry. He is then going to travel up to Sharpsburg itself and would actually tour the battlefield there at Antietam with George McClellan. And the two gentlemen would actually go out to South Mountain later that day. Or actually, by October 4th. Now, what's particularly sad about this visit is that by the end of it, McClellan thinks he has a friend in the president. He comments about this in his private letters to Mary Ellen and also years later in his memoirs, that the president is the best friend he has in Washington. But he knows that as soon as the president is away from the army, McClellan's enemies in Washington will have their hooks in him once more. And we see an example of that with this October 6th telegram. Now, Abraham Lincoln is going to leave the battlefields of Antietam and South Mountain and come back here to Frederick, Maryland, where he would board a train and head back to Washington, D.C. Excuse me. Just 2 days later, we would see a telegram from General-in-Chief Henry Halleck demanding an advance of the Army of the Potomac. The president directs that you cross the Potomac and give battle to the enemy or drive him south. Your army must move now while the roads are good. If you cross the river between the enemy and Washington and cover the latter, by your line of operations, you can be reinforced with 30,000 men. If you move up the valley of the Shenandoah, not more than 12 or 15,000 can be sent you. The president advises the interior line between Washington and the enemy, but does not order it. So Halleck is trying to give McClellan a couple of different options here. He is suggesting the president has a favorite of these options, but he's not ordering him to do one thing or the other. Now, part of the problem here is that this telegram actually came on the heels of another telegram. On October 4th, the same day that McClellan and Lincoln are kind of understanding each other, and then Lincoln leaves for Washington, on October 4th, McClellan had received yet another telegram from Washington, D.C. and the War Department ordering that Jacob Cox's division be sent back to the Kanawha Valley over in Western Virginia. So McClellan's a little confused by this. He's going to respond to the October 6th telegram. Your telegram ordering Cox's division to Clarksburg was received before the one directing the offensive across the Potomac. Is it still intended that Cox should march at once? It is important in making my decision regarding the route to be taken by the Army that I should know first what description of the troops I am to be reinforced with upon the Shenandoah route, also upon the other route between the enemy and Washington, whether they are to be old or new troops, or what proportion of each. So McClellan is concerned about the quality of men he's going to be sent, depending on the route he takes. Are we talking all green, inexperienced troops, or are we talking veterans? And there's a little bit of both in the defenses of Washington at this point. Excuse me, not a little bit. There's a lot of federal troops in Washington at this point. Now, while all of this back and forth is going on, we are going to be having a number of political events occurring. First, we would actually see the first inkling of what becomes known as the Loudon Valley Campaign in a discussion that McClellan would have with his corps commanders on October 7th. We would also have McClellan's response to the Emancipation Proclamation that day in General Orders number 163, where he would reiterate that the Army's subservient role to the civilian authority and concludes, quote, "The remedy for political error, if any are committed, is to be found only in the actions of the people at the polls." So, as many of you are aware, McClellan is a staunch war Democrat. He's really been trying to avoid the question of slavery as much as possible, and he's not thrilled with the emancipation. But he's telling the Army, look, if you've got an issue with this, settle at the polls. We do not make political decisions. But while these politics and policies are being debated outside and within the Army of the Potomac, the Confederacy is going to act. And we would have, beginning on the 10th of October, the second ride around McClellan. Jeb Stuart is going to receive his orders on October 8th from General Robert E. Lee to proceed to the rear of Chambersburg and endeavor to destroy the railroad bridge over the branch of the Conococheague. Any other damage that you can inflict upon the enemy or his means of transportation, you will also execute. You are desired to gain all information on the position, force, and probable intention of the enemy, which you can. So Stuart is going to begin his raid on the 10th of October at around 3 a.m. with about 1,800 picked men. They are going to make for Chambersburg, Pennsylvania, and capture that town by 7 p.m. on the same day. So that's a pretty long ride. Problem is, the bridge over the Conococheague is made of iron. So when they go to burn it, they can't. But they are going to make their way into Pennsylvania, and up there in Chambersburg, they're going to be getting into the Chambersburg Railroad Depot. Confederate horsemen are going to help themselves to clothing, weapons, equipment at the railroad depot and burn the rest. Approximately 5,000 muskets are destroyed, along with the depot, the rails, and the telegraph. Now, the federal response to this is going to be a pursuit of the Confederate cavalry, which would begin on October 11th. Pickets will be alerted along the Potomac River and near Monocacy Junction. And it's actually due to the alertness of these federal pickets and the fact that we have a concentration of federal forces around Frederick that Stuart decides not to raid Frederick, Maryland on his downward sweep back towards the Potomac. Actually, before we do that, we're going to leave this up here. Now, the results of the raid would be between 9 and 10 a.m. on October 12th. Jeb Stuart and his command have recrossed back into Virginia. In the last 24 hours of the raid, his cavalry had rode 90 miles. That's really hard on both the men and horses. The raid has done an estimated $200,000 in damages, and approximately 1,000 horses were captured, as well as a number of dignitaries and things like that. This is seen as an embarrassment to the federal cavalry. One officer actually describes it as a burning disgrace. Now, with this raid, with the federal cavalry's inability, though a very good attempt to try to get Stuart, there is actually a really impressive effort done by Pleasonton and the federal cavalry to get Stuart. They will be unsuccessful. And we would see a number of reconnaissance missions being sent out into Northern Virginia at this time to try to figure out what's going on and how active the Confederates really are. And this would begin with the Charlestown-Smithfield reconnaissance, done by Winfield Scott Hancock and General Andrew Humphreys. We see the two gentlemen there. This map shows the Potomac River in light blue. Shepherdstown, West Virginia is where we would have Humphreys' forces moving out across the Potomac at Shepherdstown and then moving down. They're supposed to be making for Smithfield, but they would run into Confederate resistance near Leetown. General Hancock has a much easier mission. He's going from the Harper's Ferry area near Bolivar down to Charlestown, and he would succeed in capturing Charlestown very quickly. Now, the Army of the Potomac is scrutinizing itself and, of course, being scrutinized by the War Department during these reconnaissance. Lincoln is going to write McClellan a message that arrives on October 16th, prodding action, but these reconnaissance missions are already underway when the message arrives. In Washington, McClellan is seen as not being worried about time, where President Lincoln absolutely is, and that's going to be one of these friction points between the two men. As we said, the same day that this message, again kind of prodding McClellan to do something, arrives, McClellan is doing something by sending out these reconnaissance forces. In addition to the Smithfield and Charlestown raids, we're also going to have additional forces moving towards Lovettsville. And this is Brigadier General John Geary. He and his forces are going to be moving towards Lovettsville, Virginia, in the Loudon Valley, And it would be his movement into the Loudon Valley that determines that there's far, far fewer Confederates in the Loudon Valley than there is in the Shenandoah. This will actually greatly affect how the rest of this campaign will run. With this discovery, on October 21st, McClellan is going to telegraph the War Department and let them know that he would advance, quote, upon the line indicated by the president. In other words, the line that would allow him to take a defensive position between the Army of Northern Virginia and Washington, and potentially get even more reinforcements from D.C. With this determination, the campaign would begin on October 26, 1862. It would be around 8 a.m. that Union cavalry under Alfred Pleasonton, the gentleman with the magnificent mustache there and short beard, he is going to lead his cavalry forces across the Potomac River at Brunswick, what was known at that point as Berlin, Maryland. And he would be backed up by, of course, everyone's favorite be-whiskered general there, Ambrose Burnside, with the Union 9th Corps. The two commands would be coordinating together, and this was a vanguard of a force of approximately 110,000 men in the Army of the Potomac at this time. That's 110,000 troops with approximately 1,830 wagons to move the army, and around 6,000 or so support staff and other folks that are helping keep the army moving. So all told, we're going to have about 116,000 people moving with the Army of the Potomac. This is actually one of my favorite images from the American Civil War. It's a little bit later in the campaign, but it does show the two pontoon bridges at Berlin, or again, Brunswick, Maryland, that have been thrown across the Potomac River, and federal forces, particularly the supply wagons, gathering and waiting their turn to go across. Though we would have Federals leading off near Brunswick, we would have crossings at Harper's Ferry that would begin shortly thereafter. The Berlin column consisted of Pleasonton's cavalry, the 1st, 6th, and 9th Corps, while the Harper's Ferry column consisted of the 2nd and 5th Corps. So thousands of men now pushing across these waterways. The Army would move south parallel to the Blue Ridge, taking the passes in the Blue Ridge as it went. Both columns were to head for Warrenton, Virginia, and the Manassas Gap Railroad. So I don't know if this is visible to everybody, but these three gaps here are all going to be captured as federal forces push southward. And we've got Let's see, that's one of the other gaps in the Bull Run Mountains. That's what these two yellow circles are, is the two gaps in the Bull Run Mountains as well. And they're going to be pushing south towards Warrenton, Virginia. Now, obviously, these crossings are not going to go unimpeded. We would actually have, upon entering the Loudon Valley, one Union officer would speak in glowing terms of the terrain. I have passed through no such farming region before in either Virginia or Maryland as we have here in Loudon County. So the troops, particularly the federal troops, are pretty impressed by what they're finding. Though rain fell and slowed the progress of the infantry, Pleasanton's troopers would reach Purcellville, Virginia on October 27th. From here, the patrols were sent out to locate Confederate forces. And one of those patrols is going to begin to climb Snicker's Gap, the first of those three big gaps we were looking at. One such patrol would be led by the 8th New York Cavalry, who's going to climb the Blue Ridge, as we said, at Snicker's Gap. Only half a mile up the gap, they came under artillery fire, and the regimental historian later admitted that the regiment went down the road faster than they had come up. Understandably so. This image actually is one that I took. You're looking through Snicker's Gap into the Shenandoah Valley. Now, we would begin to see Confederate reactions to these movements as early as October 28th. Confederates under Jackson are going to consolidate, and James Longstreet's wing of the Confederate Army would start to push southward. We would also have, on the 30th, Jeb Stuart himself crossing into the Loudon Valley, and he's going to bring with him some help. Not only is it going to be his cavalry, but he's going to have Colonel William Wickham's cavalry with him as well, and the artillery, the horse artillery of Major John Pelham. And it would be this cavalry command that is going to stymie the Federal advance for several days. And we're going to get into that shortly. But before we do have the movements here to look at. You can see there with Purcellville, Federal forces kind of moving out in multiple directions. Snicker's Gap, the Confederates have moved through and are now concentrating around Bloomfield. Longstreet's begun to push south, and Jackson is concentrating along the railroad outside of Winchester. October 31st, Halloween, is going to turn out to be a very scary day for the 1st Rhode Island Cavalry. As part of Brigadier General George Bayard's command, they are going to be attacked from Aldie Gap by Confederate cavalry, and they would be scattered on the Snickersville Turnpike. This skirmishing would continue for the rest of the day. So Confederate cavalry are now involved. They've gotten the jump on one Federal cavalry regiment. But, but now that we have forces concentrating in the Loudon Valley, we would see the largest engagement of this campaign begin the very next day, November 1st, in what's known as the Battle of Unison. With the First Corps arriving at Percival, Pleasanton's cavalry advanced, hoping to reach the Upperville that day. Reaching Philemont at 11 a.m., a squadron of the 8th Pennsylvania Cavalry ran into Stuart's pickets near the North Fork Ford. With the arrival of the rest of the 8th Pennsylvania and the 3rd Indiana Cavalry, the Confederate pickets fell back to the rising ground west of the ford. And that's what we're seeing here, is this initial clash on the map. Now, some of the soldiers involved in this, of course, would be John Pelham. That's a pre-war photo of Pelham there. And we would also have Federal artillery, the Battery M of the 2nd United States Artillery under Lieutenant Alexander Pennington. These two men would be dueling with their artillery during the clash at the North Fork Ford. Stuart is going to stymie the Union advance there on November 1st, and both sides prepared for a continuation of the action on November 2nd. Now, Pelham there, he has actually set up his guns, and you can still see this battlefield today. You can go down to Unison and see all this. He's actually in the ruins of the Carr House, which can be seen right there. And then Battery M is on the opposite side where the truck is. That's actually a buddy of mine's vehicle. That Ford is still allowed to be driven through, and I'm very glad we had a very large truck that day to do it when we did that trip. But the Federal artillery is on that side of the North Fork, where Pelham's guns are on rising ground near the ruins of the Carr House. On November 2nd, General McClellan would actually write to President Lincoln stating the entire army will advance rapidly today, and if possible, the cavalry advance tonight will be near Springfield on the Manassas Gap Railroad. So George McClellan is looking for big things to happen with his cavalry, even though they've already begun to engage at Unison. November 2nd would be described by Hiros von Borka, a major with Jeb Stuart's cavalry, as a rich, soft day with all the splendor of the autumnal sunshine and all the quietude of the Christian Sabbath. That quietude, though, would be broken by the fighting that would have raged through the streets of Unison and along all these lanes and stone walls that we would see utilized by both sides during the fighting. Little plug for the town of Unison. It's a very quaint little town, and they have a really interesting cottage industry of honey down there. So a little shout out for Unison honey. Good stuff. But on the 2nd of November, we would have the fighting of the Battle of Unison moving right through the town. Again, both sides are going to take advantage of the town itself, and we would have those stone walls being mentioned. Now, Stuart's delaying tactics were working as the Federals were forced to fight nearly fence to fence and house to house. This allowed the Confederate cavalry to redeploy to the Quaker Meeting House southwest of town. And again, hopefully we can see the mouse moving there, but that's the Quaker Meeting House down in the lower left-hand corner. As Federal forces shook themselves out into lines of battle just beyond Unison, the artillery would open up a duel with each other at about 800 yards. And it would also be during this point that we would see some of the exploits of John Pelham. Many of you are familiar with Pelham, no doubt. He is with the Confederate horse artillery. He's actually going to take one gun way out onto the flank of this Federal line and begin to engage it in an enfilading fire. We'll see that in just a moment. There we are. We can see his one gun throwing way out to the side, and he begins to fire up the length of these Union lines of battle before eventually being driven off. Now, the delay of the Federal advance caused by Pelham's exploits allowed Stuart to fall back again beyond Beaver Dam Creek to Seaton's Hill. Pelham's guns once more began to bark, firing on their former position at the Quaker Meeting House and at the advancing infantry. Stuart, according to the 3rd Indiana Cavalry, in their history, I should say, would actually write fairly admiringly of him and his tactics, commenting that Stuart was contesting every step of the advance. A couple of shots of Unison here. This is the main road out of Unison that Confederate and Federal forces were fighting down. Both of these structures, and the large house there on the bottom and the Methodist church above, will be utilized as hospital sites, and will the estate at Fiddler's Green. All of these structures being used as hospital sites following the fighting and during the fighting, honestly, at Unison. We would also have Federal forces eventually gaining the area of the Quaker Meeting House. So we said that Pelham would engage his former position there. That blank field that you see is actually where the Quaker Meeting House was. It's no longer there, but interestingly enough, the Quaker cemetery there is quite well maintained and continues to be maintained to this day. Now, with Stuart falling back to Seaton's Hill, and again, we see the Widow Seaton house right there in Seaton's Hill, this is going to be his final position by the end of November 2nd. November 3rd, however, we're going to begin to see the weather turn. Up until this point, we had had very good marching weather for both Union and Confederate forces, but we would begin to see that turn as cold, wet, blustery weather comes in. Stuart is actually going to take up position, falling back yet again, this time behind Panther Skin Creek. Stuart had delayed the Union advance for 2 days at this point, but more Federal forces, 3 regiments of cavalry, and a battery of artillery had arrived during the previous night. The Confederates, however, had once again redeployed and had taken up position behind, as we said, Panther Skin Creek. On November 3rd, the weather has gone to garbage, and we would see Federal forces trying to move down multiple roads towards the Confederate position. Here in the middle, that picture that just showed up, that is Captain Tidball of the Federal Artillery. He will be attempting to force the center of the Confederate position. Off to the left, we see the 8th Pennsylvania Cavalry kind of having difficulty out there on the Trap Road. But the close-range artillery support that's being provided by Tidball and Pennington will allow for the arrival of the 95th New York Infantry near the Fletcher House. They're going to begin to turn the flank of the Confederate position. By 4 p.m., Stuart is going to be driven off the field and begins to retreat towards Ashby's Gap. However, this is the situation. By the end of the day on November 3rd, we have Federal forces moving across the board. We do have Federal forces coming out of Washington, D.C. as well, the 11th Corps under Franz Sigel. We also have James Longstreet, who has made his way south towards the area of Culpeper, and he's going to begin to dig in there. Now, by the 4th of November, the 2nd Corps was now at Ashby's Gap, and politics far from the front are going to be on the minds of many, because November 4th, 1862, is the midterm elections. And that's why I chose this talk for today. We've got the elections today. Well, we have elections affecting campaigns 160 years ago this year. So midterm elections are not going to go great for the Republican Party under Lincoln, but it's not going to be too bad. The Republicans actually do gain a seat in the Senate, but they lose 21 seats in the House of Representatives. They still have a majority, but it's not a dominating majority that they'd had before. More concerning to Lincoln, though, is the loss of 2 governorships. The powerful state of New York and also New Jersey would no longer have Republican governors. Now, November 4th would also see additional fighting near Manassas Gap. Fighting at Piedmont and Markham nearly saw Colonel Thomas Rosser, which is the gentleman with the large beard in the Confederate uniform, and his command dispersed by Brigadier General William Averill's horse soldiers. That's Averill there to the right. Rosser's artillery support will allow him to fall back towards the Gap, and more specifically Barbee's Crossroads, a crossroads we're going to hear a bit more about shortly. And on November 5th, we would have, again, orders going out across the board. The 1st Corps moved to Rectortown and White Plains, 1 division of the 2nd Corps to the intersection of Paris and Piedmont with the Upperville and Barbee's Road. The 6th Corps to the Aldie Pike, east of Upperville, the 9th Corps beyond Manassas Railroad between Piedmont and Salem, with a brigade at Manassas Gap. Pleasanton gained a handsome victory over superior numbers at Barbee's Crossroads. And we'll talk about that fight here shortly, but what we're seeing with this report is that Federal forces are moving, and they're moving across the board. Now, the fight at Barbee's Crossroads was between Wade Hampton, who we see here, and Colonel Benjamin Grimes Davis. Interestingly enough, Davis here is of Alabama birth, and he was raised in Mississippi. But he's a Union man. He had gone through West Point. He's been in the Army his whole career, and he stays loyal to the Union. And he would command the 8th New York Cavalry. Now, Stuart, upon hearing of the Federal advance on Warrenton, is actually going to order a retreat on the afternoon of November 5th. As his troopers break off, Hampton is going to order a charge against elements of the 8th New York under Grimes Davis. Unfortunately for Hampton,
The time is now 8:40, and the library will be closed in 20 minutes. Bathrooms will be locked soon, and if you need help finding an item, please visit the nearest information desk. If you need to check out materials, please make your way to the circulation desk or to the self-checkout machine at this time. Thank you.
apologies, we had a little announcement over the PA there. Excuse me. So Wade Hampton, he's going to break off, or Stewart's going to break off, but Hampton's going to try to get in one more punch there at Barbie's Crossroads before he has to withdraw, and he's going to charge elements of the 8th New York Cavalry. But Grimes Davis has used the terrain to his advantage. He's put a bunch of his troopers down behind all these stone walls that we see in the Loudon Valley, and he will devastate the Confederate cavalry on their charge, throwing them back. Once again, we have the map here. We can see federal forces under the Union 1st and 9th Corps beginning to concentrate around Warrenton, Virginia, and the rest of the army is closing that direction. But November 5th, it happens. With the midterms over, Lincoln was now free to move on George McClellan, something his advisors had been howling for quite some time. On November 3rd, James Longstreet's corps had reached Culpeper, and by the 5th, his entire command was present and had dug in along the Orange and Alexandria Railroad. The Confederates, in part, had succeeded in getting back in front of McClellan. That's exactly what Lincoln did not want to happen, and it's going to be all the excuse he needs to remove General McClellan from command. And on November 5th, he would write the order relieving General George B. McClellan and making other changes. Executive Mansion, Washington, November 5th, 62. By the direction of the President, it is ordered that Major General McClellan be relieved from the command of the Army of the Potomac and that Major General Burnside take command of that army. Also, that Major General Hunter take command of the corps in said army, which is now commanded by General Burnside. That of Major General Fitzjohn Porter be relieved from command of the corps that he now commands in said army, and that Major General Hooker take command of said corps. The General-in-Chief is authorized in his discretion to issue any other substantiary orders substantially as the above, forthwith or as soon as they may deem proper, from Abraham Lincoln. So Lincoln is removing McClellan from command, but it's going to take a couple of days for that order to actually get out into the field. McClellan is going to be informed on November 7th of his removal. We would have sporadic skirmishing on the 6th and 7th as the Army of the Potomac was closing around Manassas Gap and the railroad at Warrenton. McClellan's removal order was to be hand-delivered to him at his headquarters at Rectortown. Major General Ambrose Burnside, one of McClellan's oldest friends, was told he was to take over command of the army, as we saw. Burnside protested, but would later relent when the other option was that for his old rival, Joseph Hooker, to command the army, something that Burnside was absolutely opposed to seeing happen. Now, Burnside, we're going to stay on this image. Burnside is going to arrive at McClellan's headquarters late on November 7th amidst a blowing snowstorm. McClellan later stated that he suspected the nature of the visit from his friend and the War Department representative that was with him, Brigadier General Buckingham. After some small talk, Buckingham suggested to Burnside that they get down to business. McClellan received the removal order and, keeping his composure, simply stated, "Well, Burnside, I turn the command over to you." The next day, November 8th, the Army of the Potomac had already had its marching orders, and McClellan has his command, or I should say his headquarters, moved to Warrenton. Burnside is going to request that General McClellan stay on for a few days to ease the transfer of power. Mack agreed and wrote his final dispatch to the Army of the Potomac. Now, newspaper coverage of McClellan's removal and the subsequent review of federal forces is going to be extensive. This newspaper coverage actually begins on November 9th and would last for days. On the 10th, a review of the 1st, 2nd, and 5th Corps would be held as a final salute to the Army of the Potomac's most controversial commander. By November 10th, however, McClellan, by the end of the day, is gone. And there is significant feeling amongst the troops within the ranks. Let's read a couple of expressions by the men themselves. There was a considerable expression of feeling. No acts of insubordination occurred. There was talk of resignations by officers, but not in our brigade. Major Rufus Dawes of the 6th Wisconsin Infantry. Elsewhere, General McClellan took leave of us today. The army is in tears. My heart is full of bitterness, is too full of bitterness to say more at present. Defeat is before us. How can I help feeling badly? Captain Francis Donaldson, 118th Pennsylvania Infantry. In conclusion, Major General George Brinton McClellan had rebuilt the Army of the Potomac following the Maryland campaign. He had strengthened and given confidence to its branches, including the cavalry, which had went toe-to-toe with the vaunted horsemen of the Army of Northern Virginia, and given as good as they got at places like Unison. The Army had moved with determination, placing itself in position to defeat the Army of Northern Virginia in detail. It had literally moved in between the two wings of Lee's army. The campaign was ended prematurely, however. Soon the Army of the Potomac was headed in a new direction, under a new commander, towards a new and terrible disaster. Now, I'd like to end the presentation today with a quote from the history of the 3rd Indiana Cavalry, talking about the Loudon Valley following the campaign there in '62. The country where rested the remains of so many brave men of both armies, and which had been marched and countermarched over so often by both armies, in the dreary late autumn days of 1862, had much the appearance of a barren waste, and vast sections of it had ceased to be the habitation of man or beast. Here and there stood a lone chimney surrounded by the charred embers of some destroyed home, and an occasional straggling apple tree was all that was left to mark the civilization which in earlier and happier years marked the proud old Virginia as the mother of presidents. Again, that comes from the history of the 3rd Indiana Cavalry. And I encourage you folks to check out the full paper that I wrote on this topic, which can be found on the Save Historic Antietam Foundation website, shaft.org. It has been my pleasure to speak with you this evening, and I'm happy to answer any questions you might have on this topic. So thank you very much. All righty, we do have a few questions here, so that's great. Let's see what we can do. Let's see. Mr. Thompson writes, Matt, what is your opinion about whether McClellan's performance in this campaign has justified his removal or not? That is an excellent question, because I don't think it does. George McClellan, as we were saying kind of during the wrap-up, is moving aggressively. He has placed the Army of the Potomac between the two wings of Lee's army and has the opportunity to potentially crush James Longstreet's forces down near Culpeper. Now, McClellan is going to be removed before that option can make itself known and before federal forces can concentrate to go after Longstreet, but the opportunity is there. The potential is there, but is never able to develop itself. So thank you. That's an excellent question. And I do think, for those of you who may be wondering, I do think that it was political ramifications behind McClellan's removal more than anything. Not all of my colleagues and fellow historians agree with that. There's some actually very good historians who argue that it had less to do with politics. I actually think that it has almost everything to do with politics. McClellan is a war Democrat. He is a staunch war Democrat, but he is still a Democrat. And the keeping him in power was very beneficial to the Lincoln administration up until the point that the midterms are done, and at which point he can be removed. Now, interestingly enough, as many of you folks know, and of course our friends here at the Frederick Library know, McClellan would be back again
not in a military aspect, but in 1864, he will run against President Lincoln in the presidential election. Of course, he is soundly defeated in that effort. Let's see. In addition to your paper, are there any books in particular that you'd recommend reading about this campaign? Northern Virginia, November 1862. No. Unfortunately, there were not. Pardon me just a moment.
Computers will begin to turn off and bathrooms will be locked. If you need to check out materials, please proceed to the circulation desk or to a self-checkout machine now. Thank you.
We got our 10-minute warning here at the library. Unfortunately, there's really not that many works on this campaign in secondary studies. It is definitely something that I am looking into writing myself with a colleague, but there is unfortunately not a lot of works that cover just this campaign. I did a lot of digging through newspapers, through unit histories, of course, the official records of the War of the Rebellion to develop this particular talk and paper, but we don't have a whole lot on just this campaign in book form. There's been a couple of good articles, including one in Blue and Gray magazine that did one of their famous tours. That can still be found out there, and I found it very useful when I went and actually did some site visiting around Unison. But I'm afraid there's no real books about this topic yet, not that I'm aware of at least. Let's see. You mentioned a few battlefield sites in the area. For someone planning a road trip, are there one or two that you feel are essential to stops that help tell this story? Definitely check out Unison. It's a cool little town. It's basically the same as it looked in 1862, but I also recommend Purcellville, Lovettsville, all those little towns in the northern Loudon Valley. They are in really good shape, historically speaking. And you've got a lot going on in that region in both 62 and 63. So you're going to be getting a lot of history when you're visiting those little towns. Of course, further down the valley, we have that series of cavalry engagements that we see at the opening of the Gettysburg campaign with Upperville, Middletown, and Aldie. The three fights down there. That's all in that same region. So definitely check that out. See. Yes, here at Frederick.
So I'm assuming that McClellan's papers ended up somewhere, and particularly the papers between him and his wife.
Yes, the question here was McClellan's papers, and they ended up somewhere. Yes, the Library of Congress has those papers. They actually have digitized a large portion of them. Now, I don't know if all the correspondence between him and Mary Ellen have been digitized. A number of McClellan's personal papers and reports have been by the Library of Congress. And digging through those was also very helpful, especially on the day-to-day entries in his journals and writings and things of that nature.
Do you know how they got to LC? Did he donate them, or they came later through the family?
I'm assuming the question was, how did they get to the Library of Congress? I don't honestly know. I'm assuming they were donated because, unfortunately, McClellan writes a memoir, and then the manuscript burns up in a house fire. He writes a second memoir, but it's very much redacted. It's not quite the right term, but reduced from what the original one is implied to have been.
So the first one burned before it was published.
Correct. Exactly. Let's see. We've got a few questions here. Let's see. Matt, those are the only questions we have at this point. You're welcome to wrap up when you're ready. Let's see. Do you think that this campaign showed a new Little Mac more willing to take the initiative? I do. I absolutely do. Again, the question was, do you think the campaign showed a new Little Mac more willing to take initiative? Yes, it absolutely does. General McClellan fights well at Antietam. I know that's heresy in some circles, but the Army of the Potomac wins at Antietam. They pursue Lee's army and then have to go into rest and resupply mode. They absolutely need to. So does Lee. McClellan is building the army on the move during the Maryland campaign. He has merged three forces to fight at Antietam. He has brought in his army, the Army of the Potomac, the recently defeated Union Army of Virginia, and the Washington garrison. He's merged them into one fighting force. He is still working with this as he begins the Loudon Valley campaign. But I really think that he gets that army where he wants it to be in size of force, the types of troops he has. He's really got the army just how he wants it when he's removed from command, which is one of the real tragedies of the Army of the Potomac and his removal. But again, it's been my pleasure to speak with you all this evening. Again, thank you very much to the History Consortium for having me, and of course, the Frederick County Public Library. So
Thank you
have
very
a great
much,
evening,
Matt.
and I hope everyone gets a chance to visit the Loudon Valley.
Excellent. What a detailed presentation. Thank you so much for sharing all your research with us, Matt. We really appreciate it. And please keep in mind that our program of lectures continues tomorrow evening at 7 o'clock with Dr. Brian Jordan, who will talk about Union veterans. So thank you so much for joining the History Consortium this evening, and good night.